May this video act as a reminder to stay fresh. Hello everyone and welcome back. My name is Jessie February. I'm a Women International Master from South Africa and today marks the middle of the tournament. Round 7. All 8 participants have now played against one another and we have 2 players running away with all the points. In the first game, we had Rapport playing white against young Nepomniachtchi. And there was a moment in the game where Richard could have scored a quick draw, roundabout move 16. So this game was definitely noteworthy. And let's take a look. So the game started with e4, e5, knight f3, and knight f6. And here we have the Petrov. And after knight to f3, knight takes e4. And we have the main line d4 and d5. And other lines I'm also familiar with, which I know is possible to play here, is after c4, there is something like bishop e7, knight c3, and taking, with the idea of white long castling, etc. It's quite an interesting line if you ever want to take a look at that. And so we have d4, d5, bishop to d3, and bishop to d6, castles, and c4. c6, queen b3, and bishop to g4, and we have exchanges with knight to g5. And I have seen this line. I think we have seen the Petrov once before in the candidates. I could be wrong. Those of you in the comments can let me know. So bishop to e7 and capturing on e4. And after queen takes d4, I believe Rapport spent a couple minutes here deciding whether to take on b7 or not. And the other move that was also normal here was rook e1. So decided to go with queen takes b7, queen takes e4, capturing the rook and bishop to h3. And here was the opportunity that Rapport had to play a repetition. So after h3, there was queen to d3, and after king g2, there's queen g6 again, king h1, and now king g2 back again could have been played, then offering that sort of repetition of moves and calling it an early day. However, Rapport decided to play knight to d2, queen to d7, knight to e4, and knight to a6. And here, Richard is forced to give up the queen for 2 rooks and decides to do so. And I believe watching the live broadcast and also seeing Nakamura walk past the board, and I think I can find the clip to show you his reaction to this game. We had rook a to d1, h6, bishop to g3, and knight to c4. Rook f to e1, knight e6, a3, and h5. Rook d3. And over here, the engine was already indicating that the position was a lot better for black. And after doubling up the rooks, capturing on e4, and the queen goes to f2 here. h3, bishop to e7, and bishop back to h2. And even after bishop to g1, queen to d2, and going back with the rook, there's queen d3, and blocking the way of the queen, e4 is still hanging. And after bishop to f6, there's bishop takes, a7, and unfortunately, there is no coming back after bishop to h4, and Richard Rapport decided to resign. This put Nepo in an even bigger lead, now sitting with 5.5 points out of 7 games, and Fabiano Caruana seems like the only one who can catch up to him right now. Let's take a look at the next game. In game 2, Jan-Christoph Duda played the white pieces versus Hikaru Nakamura. And after the game developed, pieces were exchanged and a draw was agreed at move 40 with the rook and pawn ending. So here we have the Nimzo Indian, and after bishop to d3, we see c5 and some exchanges in the center. Knight takes d5, castles a3, bishop to d6, rook e1 here, and knight e7. And this is quite a nice setup here for white. I mean, white goes back to c2, brings the queen to d3, threatening an immediate mate in 1, but of course f5 just stops that. Bishop to b3, redirecting its forces and just exchanging on d5. And after bishop to f4, offering another exchange of minor pieces, and after rook to e4, Rook d1 avoids the exchange of rooks over there. h4 just solidifying the really strong square here for the knight, stopping a future g5 and also aiming towards the d5 square. And after g6, b4 and bishop to a4. And here we have a trade of rooks and then the queen. And already we find a minor piece in rook ending here, knight to e6. And there we have them exchanging the minor pieces and transposing to a rook and pawn ending. And on move 40, they agreed to a draw. In game 3, we had Ding Liren play the white pieces versus Alireza Firouzja, with Ding opting for the English opening. Let's jump in. So we have c4, e5, and g3. And this sort of setup reminds me of the reverse Sicilian, where d5 often is played, getting the knight to b6 later on and developing as white would against the Sicilian. But here we see bishop to c5 and d3, castles, knight c3 and c6, knight f3, d6, and some very simple developments. And after d4, they exchange on the d4 square and knight goes to c2. Bishop f5 puts pressure here on this diagonal, pinning the knight to the rook, and bishop d2 with a discovered attack on the queen, knight to d7 and rook c1. Queen goes back to a7, trying to avoid this discovery, and just puts pressure on the f2 pawn after b3, exchanging, and rook to e8. Then we have knight to a4, and here black decides to contest that bishop, taking on g2 and d5, and swapping off another pair of minor pieces here, with white having the bishop and black having two knights, queen to h5, rook to d8, queen c2, and knight to e4. So another pair of minor pieces are traded here, and even after b5, the queen just swings back to c5 and trading queens and a pair of rooks. And there we have, by move 30, already two knights on the board and a rook each with 4 pawns each as well. And it's completely drawn, and let's see how the rest of the game fares out. We have some maneuvers, some checks, and regardless, nothing significant here. And here on move 54, they agreed on a draw. The fourth and final game was one of the most exciting games of the round. We had Fabiano Caruana play with the white pieces versus Timur Radjabov. Of course, by this time, Jan Nepomniachtchi had already won his game and was sitting with 5.5 out of 7. Fabiano needed to win the game to secure the second place after the 7th round, only trailing by half a point to Jan's 5.5, sitting with 5 points. And here, he definitely won quite a convincing game. Let's take a look. So Fabiano Caruana with the white pieces here. And this is very common to see, and it's often seen in setups like the Marocci bind. And after e5, decides to play knight to f5. And after d5, very nice maneuvers here, and knight d4 completely blocking off the queen from protecting the pawn, allowing queen to d5 later on. So bishop d3, queen takes, and here it's even possible to capture on d2. But decides not to and plays queen to d7. After castles, knight f6 and bishop to g5, bishop e7 and rook e1 and long castles. And this is one of the first interesting moves of the game, considering how weak the queen side actually looks. Recommended here was also short castles, so after castles, rook takes e5 and knight to c6, just attacking the rook, capturing on f6. So bishop takes f6, and rook to d5. Queen e7 and bishop to c4. After king b8, queen decides to go to d3, and after queen b4, bishop b3, just defending the pawn on b2, knight to d4, and we see some exchanges over here. So after the queen exchange, bishop just drops back to d3 and knight c6. And finally, we see the bishop has reached a very strong square and has solidified itself on e4. After doubling the rooks on the d file, things are looking a lot better here for white. And after exchanging on c3, knight to e5 and protecting the pawn on c3. So after f6, king g3, and here we see such amazing technique here by Fabiano. He simply walks the king over to the king side and poses the question to the g-pawn. Is there anything to defend you from the king's wrath? So after rook to d4, rook c5, and the king marches over to h4, h5, and after b5, pushing the knight away, doubling up the rooks to once again attack the knight and keep control over the d-file, rook to d3, and here just defending the pawn but also offering a trade of rooks in the case of rook takes. So knight takes instead, bishop to f3, not willing to give up that bishop just yet, knight takes a2. Who even needs queenside pawns when you have a king that far up the board? And the king starts munching on the kingside pawns. And here we have b4, and the pawn starts to look very dangerous. However, after rook to d2 and a5, and the counter blunder here was rook takes d7, rook takes d7 check, and f6. Both queening at the same time, and queen to g6 check. It's amazing. I absolutely love this. And after queen to e8, king to d6, and there are no more successful checks left. This position is completely won for white, forcing a trade of queens with queen to e5, and after that being able to promote the pawn even after knight to b5, king to d7, and supporting this pawn, Radjabov resigned. And that is round 7, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It was a pleasure being able to talk about these games. I was also taking a look at these games live on stream today, so I had a better idea of what I was looking at. And honestly, it just reminds me why I'm such a huge fan of these players. So don't forget to check out the live broadcast, which is happening at 3 p.m. Madrid time every single day, with some rests after every 3 games. It's a long 14 rounds and players need their rest. But thank you so much for being here, and I will see you tomorrow.